Sharon, this is our second time meeting for the Self-Connection podcast, and I thought
Mm-hmm.
just by way of introduction, we could talk about the name Self-Connection and what that means to both of us, and
Mm-hmm.
how many of the themes that and the work related to Virginia Satir is related to that. So
Mm-hmm.
uh, maybe I can start because that was a word and a
Sure.
phrase that really stood out to me.
Right.
This notion of self, because in Virginia's work, she talked a lot about self-esteem. And in
Mm-hmm.
the 70s and 80s, that was kind of a buzzword in terms of
Right.
the importance of elevating self-esteem amongst children
Mm-hmm.
to sort of better various kinds of behavioral and academic outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
In my watching of her work, and I wonder how you see this, I think the word self-esteem and self-worth in the way that it's used typically in psychological literature is actually not what she meant.
Mm-hmm.
Because self-esteem, and if you look at scales and questionnaires of self-esteem, they're often about perception of self, how I see
Yes.
myself, or how I see
Yes.
others seeing me, or how I
Yes.
feel about myself, or
Right.
about competence.
Right.
But she seemed to emphasize a kind of uh, connection to a core self that,
Mm-hmm.
and the way she would describe it is the seed model, that there was
Yes.
some kind of essence of the person that was so critical and essential to how she worked
Mm-hmm.
that, you know, as I watched her and she would do sculpts, I would think, no, it's not just self-esteem. Self-esteem is almost too superficial
Mm-hmm.
to be the word that references the way she worked.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, could you speak to your experience of having worked with her and having been taught by her?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think she meant by the self or
Most
self-esteem?
of what Virginia taught, she didn't use. She didn't articulate that much. And truthfully, I don't know if I ever heard her even say self-esteem or self-worth. I mean, in the writings, you'll see that.
Yeah.
Um, but part of it, I think, is because it's exactly what you're talking about. Is that she was really talking about reclaiming your essence,
Hmm.
your spirit, or some would call it the self with a higher S,
Hmm.
and that energy space by itself feels worthy.
Right.
And that
Right.
the challenge is to get those things out of the way that come to all of us that somehow block us from fully re-experiencing what we were born with. And
Mm-hmm.
she would talk about our wholeness or being holy, and yet that we had all of us had holes in our skin to kind of represent that we get blocks in those, and we're taught unconsciously not to see what we're seeing or not to feel what we're feeling or not to talk about it. And all of those at greater and lesser extent of blocks then begin to disconnect us from that place inside that automatically feels worthy
Mm.
and lovable and valuable. So I
Yeah.
think you're right on with
Yeah.
what you're saying.
Yeah, and I think just from seeing, having never met her, I was 7 years old when she died. Never meeting her, but just seeing the way she interacted with people and families, I could see that she was speaking to that essential self or that
Yes.
core self, that capital S self.
Yes.
And
Mm-hmm.
I think, and I've really been inspired by that as a mode of being, as a way
Mm-hmm.
of connecting
Mm-hmm.
with myself or with
Mm-hmm.
in personal relationships, and then also that being a very central part to what's healing in the therapy context. Uh,
Absolutely.
yeah. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you and I can do a meditation, which I'll lead,
Mm-hmm.
which speaks and maybe facilitates an experience of self connection,
Mm-hmm.
um, and we'll go from there.
I love it. Thank
So
you.
why don't we both take a moment to close our eyes
Mm-hmm.
and feel our feet on the ground, and just starting with a few calming and centering breaths. Just feel the ease and the flow of breath, and that there is nothing you have to do to earn the breath and the connection to the life that we're in touch with right now. And just really trying to soften your body and softening perhaps the muscles of your face. Letting go for a time any particular to-dos or roles that you may have. Letting go of any particular expectations or shoulds that might be tugging at you. And just continue to feel the breath. And as you continue to breathe, trying to connect to the life, the core self that's at the heart of you. Wherever you might feel that that self lives. For some people, it's in their hearts. For some people, it's in the belly button. And sometimes it can move around. Using your breath to try to connect to that space inside of you. The space of vitality, the space of courage, the space of love. As you feel a grounding in this space of self, see if you can observe your experience from this vantage point. I am a self, I am me, and I have certain experiences and certain feelings. I'm not, or relief you can feel just being connected to yourself right now. In a moment, we'll begin to close this meditation and just let yourself connect to this place, which you can visit anytime you wish. And just gently coming.
Experiencing, having to look at myself through the experiences that she offered, that was life-changing. And, I had a master's degree in social work, and had been practicing as a social worker, as a clinical social worker. But in all of that training, I had never really had to, in depth, look at myself.
Mm-hmm.
And her belief was that was absolutely the critical part, was that, you could have all this conceptual knowledge, but if you had not done your own internal work, of course it's never done, but if you hadn't done the core stuff to create harmony with your own parts and have a sense of yourself, and have self-leadership, or what she would call being in charge of yourself, that you really could not be the healing instrument that you wanted to be with people. And that to me was life-changing. And it's an ongoing process. And out of that has come incredible creativity and ongoing energy. To me, I'm 76 years old and I'm still as
Mm,
excited about this as I was when I was in my 40s. So, a level of enrichment and excitement that is unending,
mm,
and I just continue to not only grow but appreciate the incredible
mm.
awareness and insight into intuition she had that uh, not to say she didn't have all her own faults, but there's something about the richness of her understanding that just continues to add to me.
Yeah. I want to take a moment to grab Barbara Joe Brothers' book because I was reading
Hmm.
something and she had asked Virginia herself this question, and I want to read a little excerpt if that's
Okay.
okay. I'll often comment on my sense of humor, so it doesn't have to be so tragic. My hunch is that these are the three most important things. So she mentions hope, being a full person, and making it light. And my hunch is that these are the three most important things. The ideas and the ways that I choreograph stuff excite people and they see new possibilities. That's based, of course, on the idea that as long as something remains in an abstract form, it doesn't have any life. When I make body pictures, and I think she's referencing the sculpting as
Hmm.
one tool, and things of that sort, then it comes to life.
Hmm.
And she mentions three words: hope, and life in some way.
I
And
love that, Tim.
yeah,
Yeah, wow. Hmm.
and so when I was working in a residential program in Ontario, the kids would present with all kinds of dangerous and violent behavior.
Hmm.
And when the interventions were behaviorally focused, then that seemed to escalate the behavior. And
Uh-huh.
so, how do we connect below the surface of that? And I
Hmm.
think Virginia was a very important guide for me in that. Uh, and we talked a bit about that last time in terms of what systemic means. It's seeing the larger whole beyond the
Yes.
surface level behavior and having
Yes.
an appreciation for that. And I think what you were mentioning in terms of feeling it within yourself, the importance of feeling the essence or the wholeness of yourself in order to connect to that wholeness or the self of another. It seems to be the sequence. It's like if you're not in touch with yourself as a
Hmm.
whole, as a worthy, valuable being, just by the
Hmm.
fact of you being alive, it's going to be very hard to facilitate that in a healing kind of connection. So,
Right.
yeah.
I think the hard part of all this is that it's not cognitive. So it can really be hard if your inner critic is strong and you say, now I should be worthy, I should feel lovable, I
Mm,
should feel valuable. Um, and I think that this is why the experiential part is so powerful because you're not dealing with, okay, I'm now going to think this through. And you don't, it's like, okay, one day I got it. No, you just begin to feel more valuable and worthy. Um, uh, I, I've been told that when Bill W. started a 12-step program for AA, that what he'd figured out was that people were into thinking, okay, if I can just get enough willpower,
mm,
I will, I promised myself tomorrow I will not drink anymore. And it didn't work. And he realized that it had to go to the spiritual level of releasing that. And I would say that's releasing a should part, a manager part, you know, and coming to that other place.
hmm.
Because if we're into that, I should be worthy or I should be valuable, we're stuck in the same pain, the same shame
Right,
of I can't get it, you know,
right, right.
I'm not doing
Yeah,
this right.
yeah, and I think one of the things we probably talked about early on when we first met was um, I I had a realization that a lot of the work like self-compassion and the word love as a verb is like I need to learn to love myself. I need to be
Mm-hmm.
self-compassionate with myself, and that can go off into a lot of shoulds as you're describing.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
think the thing that has helped me is differentiating between okay, if if I'm alive, you and I are alive right now, I'm making that assumption, not that we're
Mm-hmm.
in some kind of artificial reality, but we're alive, then there's some kind of human nature, some kind of life in me that is ineffable. It's difficult to really make concrete, and it's not, as you're describing, just in the thinking of it, but there's something worthwhile in me because of the fact that I'm alive.
Yes.
Then how do I connect to that? Well, it's not so much adding something. It's not adding a thought, adding behavior, adding the act of exercising and eating right and all the things that some people think of as self-loving or self-caring. It's subtracting. I think it's letting go of that kind of relationship to yourself where there's a dominance or submissive part that says, like you said, you have to do this in order to be worthy. And for me, the thing that depicts that really well is the image of a tree. You have your worthiness at the level of your roots, and you live throughout, and you express that through your actions and through your behavior. But we all start off as a seed, and we grow from there. And since becoming a parent, one of the things that I like to say to people that do have children is, when your child came into the world and you held that child in your arms, I'm sure you didn't say to that kid, I'll really love you. I'll really love you when you get
Yeah.
that PhD or
Yeah.
when you make that six-figure salary. Then I'm really going to give it to you. But
Yeah.
right now, you haven't fulfilled all your shoulds. No, you feel some kind of deep um, awe
Yeah.
at,
Oh, yes.
at
Oh,
connection to that living brilliant being. And
yes.
so
Yes.
so I think that's, for me, that's
Mm.
a picture of what is the self that we're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
and how is that separate from all the types of behavior and things
Mm-hmm.
that do need to grow and do need to change. But what's the sequence of it? And I
Mm-hmm.
think it's starting with the seed or starting with the self. There's many
Yes.
words you could use to describe it or point to it, but it is something deep inside that's when I work with people that are leaving abusive relationships, it's like, what was the place in you that enabled you to have the wisdom and the strength to do that? Like,
Yeah.
it's hard to put that in a box, but it's there, it's inside of people,
Yes.
and they make this decision. It's like, I was going to die if I stayed, so I left. It's like, well, that's evidence of your worthiness, and
Yes.
that's
Yes.
there.
Yes. I love. You're helping me even appreciate more both the concept of what Virginia called life force and the seed model, because she said the seed has all the life-giving parts in it. You didn't create the seed for the flower, and you didn't create the seed for you or for anyone else. That was already there. That's the mystery of life.
Mm-hmm.
And when you use the word awe, one of my colleagues said that when she watched Virginia, that's what she experienced. That when Virginia was working with somebody, she was in awe of that
Mm-hmm.
person.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the quotes of Virginia that I often think about is that she would say, "My intention is to go connect with my pure spirit, leaving off all my bad behavior, and looking through the dark cylinder of
Mm-hmm.
somebody else's bad behavior, and knowing on the other end of that there is a
Yeah.
pure spirit." And that when you experience that, and I get goosebumps just talking about it,
Mm-hmm.
I really believe the other person experiences that.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
and that connection, then they begin to feel it. They just feel it,
Yeah.
that I am worthy of being connected to you
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
treasured by you, and therefore eventually I can treasure myself.
Right.
And that progress, and that's maybe very, very slow depending on the amount of abuse, because I've worked
Mm-hmm.
with people who've been horrifically abused over many years, and what I've experienced, that it can come down to them believing that they blinked the wrong way when they were two
Sure.
days old.
Right.
you know, and that caused them to believe somehow I am not worthy. It's something
Mm-hmm.
about me. So we're not talking about instant. It just
Right.
depends on how much abuse there is that's blocking. It's in the cylinder,
Right.
but it's
Right.
there.
Right.
And I
Right.
absolutely believe it's there.
And you and I have talked about how we play with this metaphor of the iceberg, and that's a very prominent uh, image in the Satir model, and in the way people talk about it. And that dark cylinder could be likened to being sort of frozen up in the core of the
Yes.
iceberg.
Yes.
And I think about, the way you're describing and the way I witnessed Virginia working with people. It's, when you see someone so deeply connected to their spirit or their self, and
Mm-hmm.
they seem so engaged and they're in this state of flow, it reminds you that you have that life flowing in you too. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's what's affirming. And
Absolutely.
um, there is a man named Fred Rogers. I don't know if you know who that is, but he
Of
had a
course, of
pretty
course, of
pretty
course.
famous television show, and uh, he often quoted this line. It's, what is essential is invisible to the eye, and he would often emphasize, we're much more than our particular form of behavior and what we possess, and we're much more than what we feel at a moment in time, and that core self, which I think is the energy of consciousness, which is such a mystery. What is
Mm-hmm.
consciousness? But
Mm-hmm.
it's it's some part it's the ability to become aware of yourself, and then
Mm-hmm.
from that power of awareness to then be able to shape and start creating your experience by making
Mm-hmm.
choices. How do I want to behave? And
Yes.
Satir's emphasis on a phrase like becoming your own decision maker or
Mm-hmm.
becoming your own choice maker
Mm-hmm.
has always been an empowering kind of guide for me,
Mm-hmm.
and an important
Mm-hmm.
thing to encourage in the people
Mm-hmm.
that I work with,
Mm-hmm.
uh, to get to that place where you sometimes there's very little choices that we have, but you know uh, the decision about our attitudes, the
Mm-hmm.
decision about our how wide we're going to look, um, and our use of our perception,
Mm-hmm.
and all the different varieties of consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
expectations, rules, roles. We're much more malleable than sometimes we actually experience.
Yes. And I think when you touch that life or that essence, that all of a sudden there's so much more perspective, and
Hmm.
you're so much more open to choices. That that
Hmm.
when we're in the cylinder, as you say, or we're in that frozen iceberg place, we
Hmm.
can't really see much.
Right.
And I
Yeah.
remember very clearly the day before I left the 30 days of training with Virginia,
Hmm.
which was the hardest thing I'd ever done in my life. I'm sitting at this table at this restaurant in Crested Butte. Crested Butte is one of the most beautiful places in the world. It's in the Rocky Mountains. And I look up and I see the mountain, the tips. I see the flowers, and my body is moving. And I realize that for almost the training, I had been rigid
Yeah.
and terrified and not seeing anything other than surviving.
Yeah.
And now, wow,
Right.
I could flow, right? And
Right.
that's what you're talking about. That flowing then opens up all kinds of possibilities.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. And when you use the word flow, I think of another important word that Virginia used, which is congruence. And you've helped me understand that congruence is the free flow of energy within yourself and between self and other
Mm-hmm.
people, and also with the environment. And it's in that picture that you have of being surrounded by mountains and being able to take it all in, as you being open in the space, the relational
Mm-hmm.
space between you and, in this case, the environment. But then I
Mm-hmm.
imagine also what you brought back to your family and to
Right,
the people you work with, which is a
right.
more free flowing
Yes,
openness to that energy. And I think that speaks to the hope that Virginia mentioned in that little excerpt
yes,
that I read.
yes.
The feeling of hope is our connection to positive emotions, the
Mm-hmm.
sense that I can shape things and that I can face difficulties and that I can communicate honestly and manifest something of what I'm feeling, albeit maybe messy in the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
to say something of what's going on in me. And
Mm-hmm.
then we'll see how it works out. We'll see
Yes.
how we can learn from each other.
Right.
But having that safety and having some of the expectations or the rules of how we
Mm-hmm.
meet frees up that space so that we can really connect. And I attribute so much of that in large part to what I've learned from Virginia, and then also from connecting with people like you who have been really integral in keeping up her work and her presence in the world. You know, so thank you for that.
You're welcome. It's truly my privilege. As you talk, I was thinking about talking about openness and rigidity and choice and putting them all together and thinking that every day it's a choice in my marriage. Am I going to be rigid and right or wrong, or am I going to be open? And
Mm,
it's always there, you know.
right.
Yep.
Yeah. 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 In the last 5 years, 6 years ago, maybe now, I fell on some ice, darn ice, and I hurt my back. And at the time, I went through this long journey of learning that my back injury wasn't just about falling on the ice, but it had a lot to do with being sedentary and sitting for 10, 11 hours a day as a therapist. And so I wrote this book, Move or Die, and it was addressing how to move more throughout the day.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking of that in connection to what you just said about the choices that we make, that whether it's physically moving or
Mm-hmm.
psychologically moving or spiritually
Mm-hmm.
moving, whatever domain. And
Yes.
Satir played on all levels of experience, and
Yes.
she would encourage people to access the resources at those
Mm-hmm.
various levels of analysis, and
Mm-hmm.
say there's way more choice and way more to see
Yes.
than what your neck is, and your eyes are like this, but you have the ability to move and
Yes.
to flow and to
Right.
explore.
Right.
That's what our at least physically, at least that's concrete, and also I think
Mm-hmm.
an analogy for how much freedom we actually possess. But if I'm using myself only in a
Mm-hmm.
very linear, in a very two-dimensional way, then my
Mm-hmm.
experience then of the world is going to be very limited. So again, I think that her work inspired me to think about that in that way. And in the future, I know we'll have a chance to talk more about this metaphor of the iceberg, and
Mm-hmm.
how maybe a picture of health is melting that iceberg so
Mm-hmm.
it's fluid like water. So
One of the things she used to do to demonstrate what you're talking about with the movement,
hmm
she used to take somebody's hand and she'd say, "Okay, let's stand here." She'd take their left hand, her right hand, you know, and she'd say, "Okay, now just imagine you're really grounded and this is your home. Okay, but now I'm going to invite you to just move to the right." Okay,
hmm
and how was that? Okay, that's all right. Okay, now come back home. Okay, now we're going to take a step forward. Now we're going to come back home. Now we're going to take a step backward. Now we're going to come back home.
mm
Now we're going to take a step to the left. And now we're going to come back home.
mm
And just having your body experience both, that you've got an anchor and a home, and you can
mm
also take the risk to go any direction. Very powerful.
Wow.
Yep.
Yeah, and and that she would support that by being that presence, and I think that's, part of what made her so ahead of her time is what she was demonstrating there was what everything that's been explored in attachment theory.
Mm,
There's a secure
yes.
base. There's a
Yeah.
secure base from which you develop between the
Yeah.
child and the parent, and
Right.
then from that place, as you're calling it home, the secure base, you
Mm-hmm.
explore. And in
Yes.
that holding environment between the parent and the child, you
Yes.
develop a relationship to the unknown. So
Yes.
I'm going to venture off here, I'm going to venture off
Mm-hmm.
there, and when I get
Mm-hmm.
overwhelmed, I'm going to come home.
Mm-hmm.
And then that becomes hopefully an internalized model of how I can relate to the unknown in my
Yes.
as I'm getting older, as I'm going
Mm-hmm.
off to school, as I'm making new friends. the thing that I'd like to add is, as we're talking about this phrase self-connection,
Mm-hmm.
that as much as what I've been learning is that as much as the parent-child relationship is a model that teaches us how to have a relationship to the unknown and with our home, that the child is as much watching that relationship in the parent in their relationship to themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So how are you relating? How are you loving or connected to yourself?
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes when I'm working with parents and the parent's very self-critical, that is another relationship, not just the one between the parent and the child, to be
Yes.
mindful of and to grow and to nurture.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yes.
yeah.
I love the way you're able to articulate so fully what I'm expressing. Thank you.
Well, I think that's why we're a good team.
Yeah, we're a good team.
We
Yeah.
expand on each other, and
Yeah. Yeah.
I definitely feel like that's the essence of growth that
Yeah.
Virginia was always trying to encourage in others. And so, she touched your life directly,
Mm-hmm.
and she's touched mine indirectly.
Mm-hmm.
In a sense of, I've only been able to connect to her work through books and through
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
video, and then through trainers that have trained me,
Mm-hmm.
um, that have maybe been trained by her too. So
Right. Right.
I feel really fortunate and grateful to have the opportunity to create this with you, because we're obviously of two different generations of
Mm-hmm.
related to therapy and related to Virginia's work. So
It's fun. It's
yeah.
really fun.
Sharon, that seems like maybe a good place
Yes.
to stop for today. Any final
Yeah.
words that you'd like to share, or anything
Mm,
about how you're feeling, or?
thank you. It's just, as I say, it's really fun. It's so enriching to me to have you uh, just expand um, using all the integration of your knowledge to add to what mine. So I appreciate it.
Yeah.
It's such a reciprocal process. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think the comment that I hear from other people that have been inspired by Virginia's work is that in her work, so much of what is innovative now in different models was already in the way that she was working 20, 30, 40 years ago. So
Yes.
it's quite something,
It is. It is.
and something to unpack and to try to make sense of, because
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that's quite a feat. And so
Yes, it
it's
is.
going to
Mm-hmm.
take us some time um, to share, and then also to expand into sort of our current time ways of
Yes.
using her work. And
Yes.
yeah, I look forward to that with you.
Same here. Same here.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, Sharon. We'll see you next time.
Next time. Bye bye.